Hi everyone, good morning. This is Amy from ACWS. Thanks for joining us for the Acuity Scale training. We are just noticing we only have 8 people that are on so far, and we had 19 register. Oh, we have 9 on. So we're just going to wait a couple more minutes just to give people a chance. Hopefully everyone else comes on, and by 10:05 we will get started. We have everyone muted right now. So if you have a question, if you want to type it into the chat function on your GoToMeeting, that would be great. And we'll be back in 4 minutes. All right, we're back. Welcome everyone. Just so you know, we do have everyone muted right now, and we will go through some of the administration information for using GoToMeeting if you're not familiar. But I'm just going to see, this is Amy Mercure from ACWS. Welcome to the Acuity Scale training. I have two other colleagues that will be joining us today for the training. Irene Hoffert. Irene, can you hear me?
Yes, hi everybody.
And we also have Christoph Peck here as well.
Hello, everybody. It says my name's Christy. Don't be alarmed. It's me, Christoph.
Christoph Peck posing as Christy Lavin. Okay. So thank you all for joining. I do see, so we have 13 people on, we had 19 register, so we might have some stragglers coming in, which is just fine. This is all being recorded, so this session will be available to shelters afterwards for you and your staff to use whenever is convenient for you. We'll have it on the ACWS member support YouTube page, and all that info will be sent out. Some administration off the top. We had two members submitted questions, Ebony and Charlie, through the question function, which is new to me. And this question function, where did it disappear to? Is great. So we're going to ask, Christoph, do you have any, or Irene, any strong opinions about using the question function versus the chat?
No, that works for me.
I think either is fine.
Okay, great. Well, it's just easier to, we'll just ask everyone if you have a question to enter it through the question function as opposed to the chat. I said chat earlier. That's just kind of easier for us to manage. So we generally in training webinars keep all of the registrants' microphones muted because we often have issues with feedback and it's hard to know when you're talking over people, etc. With microphones. So we are going to try to use, we're going to use this question function while we're talking and presenting information. So you can ask a question at any time in there and we'll try to track this in live. But at the end of each session, we are going to try opening up the mics for an open floor for questions. And we'll see how that goes. If there's any feedback or if there's technical issues, then we're just going to switch back to the submitting your questions via the question function. Okay, I'm going to get into outline the content of the training today. We will do our best to answer the questions that you ask while we're presenting, because there's 3 of us on here, so we're going to be monitoring that. But just have patience with us. We will also be opening the floor at the end of each section, so keep that in mind. If you have questions as you're going, then you can save them for the end of the section would be great. If you need to ask it in the middle, that's fine as well. Okay, and what else do we have here today? So the training will be broken down into 2 sections. That was sent out on the outline of the training, and the first is will be the overview of the Acuity Scale, and this section is intended for both leadership and frontline staff. I looked at the registration and we have a bit of a mix of both. I saw we did have some EDs in there and some new names for me, so that's fantastic. Irene will be presenting the first section. The Acuity Scale is her baby and she has developed this really interesting tool. So she's our expert that will be presenting that information. The second section, we'll be looking at the tab that we have created in Outcome Tracker for entering and completing the Acuity Scale. And that will be presented by Christoph and myself. I think that's everything. Irene or Christoph, do you guys have anything to say or anything to add off the top?
No, not just right, not this second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And then I'll just ask if anyone, oh, we have one more person. Excellent. Okay, we're up to 14. If anyone, any shelter members, staff have questions about what I just said, you can submit it through the question function right now. That would be great. I'll just give you a moment. I'll pause and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, great. Doesn't look like we have any questions. This is funny. They have definitely revamped GoToMeeting since I've been on here. We can tell who is non-attentive now. I don't know if you guys can see that on your screens. But there's also a little notation for us if you have questions. I just noticed that, so that's great. Okay, so I think we'll get started with section 1, Irene, if you want to take it away.
Sure, awesome. So for those of you who have been using Acuity Scale, this might be a bit of a repeat and hopefully an update on what you already know. And for those of you who are new to the Acuity Scale, it'll be brand new. And so we really do want to make sure that you walk away today with a kind of general understanding of what this is about and how to use it. So please don't hesitate to ask questions, and we'll take the time to make sure you're comfortable with using the scale. So what you see on the screen is one of the documents that we've sent to you, or Amy has sent. That's it's titled Description and Instruction of the Acuity Scale. So this document tells you, gives you a high-level overview of what the scale is about, how it was developed, and its scoring, and how to use it. So I'm just going to refer to this when I speak to some of the sections of this document, but you can certainly follow me with the document that you have, and I would just suggest that you keep that handy as you're beginning to use the scale for reference. So the first thing to say is to say that, you know, even though I've been very much part of developing the scale, I was not the person who owns it in a way. It's the second stage shelter members who were significantly involved in the development of the scale, and we started doing that about 4 or 5 years ago. And the reason was we wanted to be able to speak to the complexity of the issues that women in second stage shelters experience. So we of course know, you know, about the addictions and mental health and other physical health issues, and a whole lot of other indicators of complexity, which you do gather, or many of you gather at intake. But what we wanted to be able to do is have some kind of a number that would actually speak to that, and also to have a develop sort of a consensus about what is complexity of women who are in second stage who are experiencing domestic violence. So the process of using the scale had involved a couple of years of literature review, looking through various indicators, having a significant number of discussions by the second stage shelter directors. And then we also tested it for reliability and validity by having people complete it repeated times, and also having the same people complete it twice so that we could compare how well it holds up. So we ended up with what we think is fairly good scale. And what we've been doing is people have been using a paper version of the scale over the last 3 or 4 years. And really we just entered the data from those paper versions ourselves and just did an analysis of what we had from that. So of course it's a lot more effective to have the information entered into some kind of database, which for us is Outcome Tracker, and that's so that you can have this data as well when you need it, as well as the data is available for collective purposes. So I'm just going to give you a couple of more points here before we move to the actual scale and talk about it. So it is, you can see the caveats here. It is intended for use with outcome tracker, and that is because we make reference to the fields that we have in outcome tracker currently. So if someone wanted to use the scale in some other context, that might be a little bit different for them. But in any case, if the scale is to be used in a different context, we would appreciate being contacted for a conversation to make sure it's applicable and relevant to what other ways people might use it. So the other bullet there is it continues to undergo revisions and testing, which just means that we are, as all scales are, we continue to refine it, and we will also talk in our second part about some of the ways that you can help us with that. But we don't expect that there will be significant changes to the scale, although we are interested in hearing what's working and what's not working with it. The last bullet there is when the scale development is complete, we intend to have the Acuity Scale completed every 6 months over the course of the woman's stay. So at this point, we're only asking you to complete it once, although as Amy and Christoph will speak to it, there is capacity now already in Outcome Tracker to complete it repeated times. So for those of you who are eager to begin doing that, we certainly welcome that approach. So I'll wait now, Amy, for any questions before I actually go to the scale itself and talk about it. Maybe give people a little bit of an opportunity to write them down or ask them.
Sounds good, Irene. I'm watching the questions for you.
Okay. All right, so I'll just move on. So another document that we've sent to you in the package was the actual Acuity Scale. So what you're seeing now is what we've been using for a few years. That is not what, this is not the format of the scale in Outcome Tracker. So it'll look different in Outcome Tracker. So it really depends on people's processes, and I know, Amy, you were going to chat to this too, but some people may choose to first complete a scale on paper and then enter it in, and other people may choose to put it directly into Outcome Tracker. So this particular document allows you to enter information on paper if you wish. It can also be used as a reference point for those of you who do not, who are paperless and go directly into Outcome Tracker. But I'm going to use this document to go over the scale with you, just so that you know how it works and what's in it. So the first thing that you see here, well, there's the assessor's name, woman's name, admission date, and date of completion. Those are all standard fields, which we're gonna also have parallel in Outcome Tracker. Then the actual scale has several headings. So you see safety here as a kind of a major subheading. So there's safety, there's poverty, that's heading B. C is supports in place. D is housing stability. E is women's mental health, wellness, or trauma. F is physical health. G is children. And then the final one, it should say H, system involvement. So you can see there's a total of 28 different items within those subscales. So I'm going to go over these items now. We might not be reading through each one, but I just would like to explain to you how this is structured and explain some places where it might might get a bit more complex. But what we've tried to do is the scale is divided into 3 potential scores. So you can have a score of 0, which means there's no issue, no complexity. Staff are not really required to provide a significant amount of support in a particular area. Score of 5 is on the other end of the scale, where the needs are great and the needs for staffing involvement are great. And score of 3 is like one in the middle, essentially, is that there is some concerns but doesn't require a huge amount of staffing support. So the reason we've gone with 0, 3, and 5 rather than 1, 2, and 3 is to make a separation, a bigger separation between low complexity, middle complexity, and higher complexity scores. So it becomes more obvious when we actually add things together. Then what you see under each item now, let's take risk of femicide, is a very detailed description that defines what each score is. So these definitions, just like the selection of the indicators, have been developed together with the second stage shelter members in many discussions and also over the course of testing. So let's look at the score 0 under risk of femicide. So the risk of femicide, we have a tool already available to us, which is the danger assessment tool. So for those of us who use the danger assessment, you would go to that tool to determine what to enter here, whether or not you would enter 0, 3, or 5. And for those instances when the woman might not complete the danger assessment questionnaire, or you do not have it completed for some reason, there's another option for you. So for example, let's take a score of 0. The danger assessment questionnaire score is 7 or less. So you would then enter 0 if that's the case. If you do not have the danger assessment scoring, then what you would have to do is make your own judgment based on your conversation with a woman. So if she reports that her likelihood of lethality, meaning death from domestic violence, or near lethality occurring is a result of domestic violence is low or unlikely to occur, then you would enter 0. So then the other 2 scores reflect the same type of structure, right? So the score of 3 would be a danger assessment questionnaire score of 8 to 13, or your the conversations in your conversations with women, she reports that the potential for lethality is high, and with the score of 5, we're looking at severe or extreme lethality risk. So then, so that's kind of the idea. This is how we are using. There are two other indicators that are also relying on surveys or standardized tools that we already have in Outcome Tracker. One is the DVSA, which is number 3 here, you can see. And the other one is PSI, which is Parents Stress Index, which I'm not going to go down there, but it's underneath the children's heading. And so again, here you can see it's the same type of thing. So if you are using DVSA, then you know what score corresponds with the score of 0, 3, or 5 in the acuity scale. And if you're not using DVSA, then you would read the second part of the definition to help you understand what score to put in. So just then to walk through quickly the number 2, level of violence. Again, you see the definition. There is no physical or sexual violence, although there could be some emotional, verbal, or psychological violence present. That is because we expect that all, or at least most, women will come in with some kind of experience like that. And the score of 3, increases the type of violence and severity, and frequency, and then the score of 5 further increases in terms of likelihood of injuries and frequency, frequent presence of violence. So again, what we would recommend is that you have this handy. Amy, we have a pop-up of these definitions, right, in Outcome Tracker?
I think Amy might be having technical issues, but yes, these are in Outcome Tracker, these explanations.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Christoph. Okay, so then so we really ask you that at least until you become used to using this scale, that you refer to the definitions before you enter the numbers, just to ensure that we are measuring the same thing across all shelters. So now that was safety. And again, if you're using paper version, you will just enter the score in these boxes, which is as a 0, 3, or 5. And then you would put those numbers into Outcome Tracker, which we'll talk about later. So then just to go through the poverty section. So here you see, again, these are reflective of what second stage shelter members thought were critical descriptors of acuity with respect to poverty. So when you are looking at a financial situation, what you will notice, and this is a good example of many of the other indicators in this scale, is that we really do look at the woman's own interpretation of her experience rather than making an assumption. So for example, we collect information about someone's income or their sources of income. Well, we could make an assumption that if somebody has a certain type of income, that might be too low or too high. Well, what we need to know really is how the income they have, what concern does that level of income create for the woman? That's what we want to know. So that's how we're measuring the complexity related to financial situation, and you'll see many other indicators as well. So a score of 0 is fine in financial situation, speaks to that there is no concern or a low level of concern with respect to the financial situation that doesn't require shelter staff assistance, right? And that adequate income is available or about to become available. Then score of 3 is woman has some moderate concern about her financial resources, and she does require some level of assistance, but she also has some supports, some employment history, some assistance that she can rely on. And score of 5 speaks to a very serious concern with income or financial resources. So, which means it does require significant support from shelter staff. So if we move to education, this speaks to the level of education. So again, if there is high school or post-secondary, that would be a score of 0 because we make an assumption, and so does the literature, that might not create as high a complexity as lack of high school, or even, which is the score of 3, as you can see, or less than a grade 9. Just to go through quickly through English and basic literacy, again, there's no score of 0 would mean that there's no issue with speaking or reading English. And that, by the way, involves both the people who have English as a second language, but also those who are English speakers, were born speaking English, who might have some literacy problems. So we want to catch both of those in this particular indicator. So that's why you can see both literacy and translation reflected across the board here. So again, 0 is no issues, 3 is some issues, 5 is significant issues. Transportation, they have a vehicle, or they can access vehicle. so some level of independence is present. Score of 3, there's limited access, but access to public transportation. And score of 5 is a significant problem where we have no access to transportation at all, or significant issues in accessing transportation. So I'm going to move down to supports in place, but just wanting to make sure, Christoph, I don't know if Amy is back, that we are that people have an opportunity to ask questions, and I can respond to those.
I believe that Amy is still having technical issues, but there have been no questions since we've started. But if we want to give people a few moments to maybe open the question section and pop in a question if they have it.
Okay, I'm just going to then go back to where I was last. So we've talked so far about poverty, and here's the poverty indicators. And we've talked also about safety, and here's the safety indicators. And remember, the scores of 0, 3, and 5. 0 meaning no issues, 3 is some issue, and score 5 significant issue. And we're often referring to complexity as a reflection of the amount of support that staff need to provide the woman to ensure that she gets the help she needs.
So we have a question.
Okay.
Is it possible to share the conversation around timelines of completing the scale?
Sure. So the time. So if I am understanding the question correctly, that is we do have it documented in that instruction document, and I'll get back to that. I'll talk about the time of completion and also scoring and what it all means after I go through the scale.
So we have some more clarity.
Okay.
Is it meant to be completed in one meeting?
No. So we're looking at, in the same way that you complete your intake, you will complete this in the first months of women's admission to the shelter. So because there's no way that you're going to know all this in the first meeting, and you need to develop the relationship so that people can be comfortable sharing this information with you. And as you will see, a lot of these items reflect the items you already have in Outcome Tracker Intake tab. So this process of completing the Acuity Scale, it goes hand in hand with you completing the intake information.
I think that answers the question.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go to supports in place. So this now speaks to isolation or presence of professional supports or informal supports, and just in general, how a woman is supported in her life. So we're looking at both the personal and formal supports, which we all know the importance of that. Professional supports, which is the shelter, but also others in the community that might provide supports. And then we added here exposure to oppression or marginalization, because the whole issue of discrimination or oppression or racism sure plays a significant role in supports. And we wanted to not lose that from the complexity counts. So to speak to the personal and informal supports, underscore of 0, so we're talking here about both the number of supports in place, but also whether or not they're perceived as positive supports by the woman. So let's say underscore of 0, you can see that there's 1 or 2 or more supports in place, because we're not going to make a judgment so that a lot of people means a good thing, but that those are almost always or always perceived as positive. And we have a bit of a definition here about what we mean by positive. Score of 3 is the supports are in place, but they might not be consistent or reliable, and may not always be in her best interest. And then score of 5, the supports might be totally unavailable, or they might be in place but kind of more described as a kind of negative supports and with unreasonable expectations. So professional supports, again, 0 would mean either no professional supports are required. So we're talking outside of shelter here. Or if they're required, then they're all in place, all needed supports are in place, they're effective, and the woman uses them. Now, score of 3 essentially well, let me go to score of 5 first of all. The score of 5 is the professional supports needed, but they're not in place, or they're not addressing needs, or the woman might refuse to engage with them, right? And the score of 3 is in between. So there might be some supports that are possible, but no contacts are established. She's willing to make linkages with those supports. There's a need, but it's not a significant challenge or a significant complexity with respect to making those linkages. And then exposure to oppression and marginalization. So here we're talking about people. We're specifically identifying 4 marginalized groups. So one is someone who is not born in Canada, one who is Indigenous, someone who is a woman of color, and someone who is LGBTQ2 is, I think, outdated. There's a much better descriptor of that, but you know what I mean. It's someone who defines their gender or sex in a non-mainstream way, I suppose is the best way to say it. So, so a score of 0 would be someone who was born in Canada and is not Indigenous and is not a woman of color and is not the same-sex relationship or LGBTQ, etc. The score of 3, now we're looking at someone who is belongs to one or two of more of those groups, but she does not require additional support from program to address the impact of the oppression or marginalization. And then score of 5 is a woman who does belong to one or more of those groups and does require support to address those issues. So then now I'm just going to go a little bit faster. So if you do have a question, please just write it down. And Christoph, you're welcome to interrupt me as soon as you see one, and I'll stop and address it.
Sounds good.
Okay. So housing stability. So here we're looking at type of housing before admission and number of times the woman that moved prior to a second stage shelter admission. So first of all, type of housing immediately prior to admission. So what type of housing was she living in just before she came to the second stage shelter? So you can see under score of 0 is fairly stable and affordable housing. And the woman can stay there for as long as she needs to. The score of 3 now is a transition or temporary housing. So if she comes to you from second stage shelter, that would be a score of 3. So it's a time limited housing of some kind. And then score of 5 is short-term housing. So now for most second stage shelters, she will come from emergency shelter. So most of them will have a score of 5 because that's a short-term housing. But then she might also be homeless, or she might be in a homeless shelter, or she might be living with family or friends over short term. So those are not stable in any way, and they will be the housing will not be available over even in interim period of time. So the number of times moved, again, we're counting all the moves that had occurred prior to her coming to the second stage shelter. So most of the women that come to a second stage shelter come from emergency shelter. So if they might have been in emergency shelter, and prior to the emergency shelter, they might have been in the house living possibly with her partner, with the abusive partner. So if that's what happened over the course of the last year, then she will have moved 2 or 3 times in the year prior to shelter admission. So 2 times she moved from her permanent resident with her partner, and then she moved to the emergency shelter, right? We do not count the actual move to the second stage shelter. So if she had not moved at all or only moved once in the year prior to shelter admission, so maybe she was actually coming to your shelter directly from her place with her partner, then that would be score of 0. So we just talked about score of 3, moved 2 to 3 times, and then if she moved residences 4 or more time in the year prior to shelter admission, that would be score of 5. So then moving to mental health, wellness, and trauma. So what we included here as measures is abuse as a child, number of prior abusive relationships, mental health concerns, suicide risk, and addiction. So I know that these are challenging sometimes to speak to by women, and I think the question earlier around how much time will we have to complete this form is especially relevant here, because there needs to be some amount of relationship built before women will share some of these things. And I know especially with mental health concerns, it might be a question for staff about, well, how do I get that question answered? So let's go right to that one. So what we're looking for here, so we do not expect people to be mental health practitioners to answer this. This is your best assessment based on your interaction with the woman and what she tells you. So there are 2 ways that we are talking about. So a woman does not personally report, and staff members have not observed any mental health concerns. So have not observed to the degree that you can or know to, and you might need to consult with your colleagues if you have questions about how to actually rate that particular issue. But if the woman personally reports an issue, then for sure we will go default to her report. So if there's no issues at all with all of these different types of potential mental wellness issues, then we score, it's a score of 0. If there are some concerns that are present, but their impact may be low, or that she's getting already professional support for it, then it's a score of 3. If there are concerns, but there's support required and it's not well addressed yet, and support is required from the shelter, then it's a score of 5. So I think the rest are fairly self-explanatory. Abuse as a child, just to mention this, that we didn't assign a score of 3 here because, if abuse happens, it's either it's significant, so it's either a score of 5 or a score of 0. Suicide risk, again, it's the same type of structure where, if there is no risk, 0, but if there is risk and it's but that there's no attempts happening, the score of 3. And then if there is risk and she does need support, then it's a score of 5. So it's a similar kind of structure with the addiction. So a score of 5 would always be something is present, some issue is present, and it requires support from staff, right? And score of 0 would be the issue is not in place currently. And the score of 3 would be the issue is in place currently, but it is supported or addressed well. So just gonna, again, remember to put your comments, your questions in, and Christoph will interrupt me if something comes up. And then physical health, we're looking at different types of physical health issues, injury resulting from abuse, and pregnancy here. So again, we are looking at the same structures with mental health, where we talked about personally reporting and observing as 2 different ways of getting at things. And then also the issue of whether or not the issue is present but doesn't require additional supports, and then the issue is present and does require significant support. So that's the same structure going through the rest of these items. And then with children, what I'm gonna, just to explain to you here, an important thing for this whole section is we're talking about children, all children that the woman has, whether or not they're with her in the shelter or not, and whether or not she has custody of them or not. Because we know that children's issues are a concern for a woman, even if she doesn't have custody of them, because she still is looking to support them generally in some way or another, and or get the custody back. So there's needs to be help provided for her in the shelter, even if she's admitted without children. So under number of children, we're talking about just the total number of children that she has, and there's breakdowns for 0, 3, and 5 corresponding with the numbers. Age of children, the breakdown has to do primarily with younger children. So if there's more younger children, then the complexity score becomes higher. And then child mental, behavioral, or physical health concerns. Again, it speaks about presence of those kinds of concerns for one or more children and whether or not that requires supports. And there's again corresponding, 0, 3, and 5 scale that speaks to that. And then child's exposure to violence. We speak to whether or not the children or a child has been exposed to violence and how frequent that violence has been and how significant it's been. So the complexity is assigned to that. And then parenting stress. Parenting stress is the same type of issue. I would just remind you here that parenting stress is speaks to the PSI. If you're completing the PSI in your shelter, then you would just go to that score and enter the score here. If you're not completing the PSI, then there's an option for you to make an assessment based on the definitions provided. So then to wrap up, the final acuity indicator system involvement, and we're talking about immigration status, legal issues, and whether or not those are addressed, and the degree to which they're addressed, and then overall system involvement. So we're looking here at, is she involved with child protection, income support, justice, health, housing, education, or immigration system? And then your score will depend on the number of systems that she's involved with. So I'll just give a real quick minute for people to write down questions before we go to a final discussion that's part of my section, and that's to talk about the administration and the timing and things. Okay, so in the Acuity instructions document, you see under page 1 here, or on page 1 under instructions, there's bullet points speaking to what you need to pay attention to when you're completing the scale. So I've already mentioned this first one, completed in Word. If you want to, or directly in Outcome Tracker, in either case, it has to be an Outcome Tracker. And please complete the scale as soon as possible. So this is, and then the next bullet is within 1 month of scale completion is what we would like you to do to enter the information into Outcome Tracker. But also, if I can just reaffirm, might not be very clear here, that we do want to do 1 month is okay to take to complete the scale. So we're asking you to update it if some significant information comes up much later, but we don't expect that that should be much later. The scores should be based on yours and woman's assessment of their situation. So while you're completing the scale as a staff member, It is based on your conversations with a woman. You're asked to complete the Acuity Scale for all women currently in your shelter. And then, so if you haven't been doing the scale so far, we're asking that you just complete it for all women currently in your shelter, and then any new women that will be admitted in the future. The next bullet there, your acuity assessment should be based on the woman's most recent admission. So she might have come into your shelter more than once. And we do want to look at her situation for this admission rather than any previous admission. So this next one, I think I've chatted to you before already. Please take this assessment based on the information provided by the woman as much as possible, so that we're asking that you minimize your own interpretation and that it's her interpretation of her situation. And then again, I've spoken to the definitions and the importance of the definitions. Please do read through them carefully before you put in your score. So the scoring, you do not need to be worried about the scoring, because the Acuity Scale in Outcome Tracker, that's another advantage of putting it into Outcome Tracker, is it'll automatically calculate things for you. So what you will end up with, and Christoph and Amy will speak to the reporting that will be available to you so that you can actually use these numbers for your own purposes, is that you'll end up with a low acuity, moderate acuity, high acuity, and very high acuity, and you'll be able to speak about the general acuity of your caseloads, your overall shelter clients, just so that you now, and you can see over the years, over the time periods, how that might change. So that's my section, Christoph. Again, I'll maybe give a couple of minutes, and then we can move on to your section of the outcome tracker.
Thanks, Irene. It's Amy. I'm back.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, awesome.
Sorry, I was there for almost, I just had audio issues at apparently one point, but I'm here and the audio is fine now.
Okay. So I just wanted to give people a couple of minutes if they had any questions about, just the general content of Acuity Scale, because the next piece is going to be about how to use Outcome Tracker to enter this information.
Right. Do you want me to open up the mics, or do you want to continue to use the question box, Irene?
Well, let's open up the mic maybe for 5 minutes and see if people are comfortable asking that way.
Sure. Christoph, can you open up the mics?
Sure. It doesn't seem to want to let me do that. I can unmute one by one.
Okay.
They muted at their end and it's unmuted. Weird.
Oh. Okay, so everybody's unmuted now, I think.
Just about, yeah.
Okay. So does anybody have a question about what we've just talked about?
Nobody has any questions?
Oh,
okay.
Oh, here's one.
Leonie does have a question. Yeah.
Okay.
So Leonie asked, is this done for all women in second stage shelter or also in shelter?
Or what? Sorry?
So Leonie, can you clarify? I feel like we should mute everyone again.
Yeah, done. I wonder if they mean also emergency shelter.
I got muted too.
Sorry,
Okay.
I got you.
That's okay. Yeah, no worries. I have power. I can unmute myself. Yeah, so no, this is only at present time, this is only for second stage shelters. We have raised a possibility about coming up with some kind of a complexity measure in an emergency shelter. And we're having these conversations right now at the data committee level. And what we're looking at right now is, because this is fairly extensive and emergency shelter stay is fairly brief, it's probably oh, sorry. Okay, now you know I have a dog. um, so so it probably mean we might need to have a conversation about, if we are to measure acuity, what would be most relevant and appropriate for emergency shelter, considering the length of stay, considering how much information people can actually gather over the 3 weeks she's there, so we need to think and talk more about that. So short answer, at this point, it's just the second stage.
And actually,
Okay,
the way it's configured in Outcome Tracker, it won't really work for emergency. So if you tried, it wouldn't work in the same way. So yeah, just second stage for right now.
Okay. Any more questions, guys? Okay, so so I think maybe we can turn over to the Outcome Tracker section. And again, if you have any questions, please, we have in the information document, I think we have an email, otsupport@acws.ca. So please contact them, and that if you have a technical question, then it'll probably be Amy or Christoph responding. And if you have a content question, then they'll direct you to me, and we'll connect together, and I'll be able to support you with that. So I think we're good.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Irene.
Yep.
We are going to take a brief 5-minute break so everyone can go to the washroom or grab a glass of water. And we'll come back and regroup here in 5 minutes and get started on the technical, the OT side of it. Okay, thank you. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
Amy, do you want me to close my screen, or can you guys just do that?
Sure. Well, I can switch it to my screen because that's
Okay.
where we'll be starting. So I might as well just change it over to mine.
Do you want me to do that, Amy?
I think let's see if I can do it.
You got it.
Perfect. Okay. All right. We'll talk soon. Be back in 5.
Okay.
Okay, we're back. Christoph, is that you typing away?
That's me typing away.
Oh, hi, Irene.
I'll just mute myself.
Sure. Christoph, are you there? Not yet. Okay, we'll just wait a moment until Christoph comes back. Okay, great. Christoph, you're back. Christoph? We can't hear you, Christoph. Can you mute yourself? Oh. All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, that was weird. I'm not sure what happened. But here I am.
Okay, great. Technology. Okay, hi everyone, we're back and we're going to be moving on to our second section, which is the Acuity Scale in Outcome Tracker. Now I am just being mindful of time. It's 11:05 and we said we're going till 11:30. So we will do our very best to keep it within that window. All right, so everyone, Christoph, can you see my screen? Can you confirm
Yes.
everyone can see my screen? Okay, so our second section, we're looking at the Acuity Scale and Outcome Tracker. So we took the hard copy form that Irene went through in the earlier section, and we adapted this into Outcome Tracker. Now, what we did that makes this a little different from any other tab that we have or form in Outcome Tracker is we linked it to the woman and her children's intake forms, and we linked it to the danger assessment, the DVSA, and the PSI. So in the scoring of the acuity scale, it makes reference to certain information that is collected, that happens to be collected through women or their children's intake. And it makes reference to 3 scales, which is the DA, the DVSA, and the PSI. So we built this handy tab to pull all that information in. So we have 2 test people for you today that we're going to show you the tab with. The first one, this test 1, is a single woman. So we're going to show you what the tab looks like for a single woman versus what it would look like for a woman with children. So when you come into the Acuity Scale tab here, you should be able to see it on all of your sites now, and it's just simply named the Acuity Scale. And we have instructions written at the top of it here. So we are still in refining this a little bit. So at the top we have date of scale completion. And through this process of prepping for this training, we realized that we need to add the assessor's name or provider. It's often what it's referred to in Outcome Tracker. So we'll be adding that. And I think we'll also be adding an enrollment link. So you can show that this Acuity Scale was completed for a specific enrollment. Although we do know second stage shelters don't tend to have multiple enrollments in the way that emergency shelters do. So the scale, the information in here, in terms of the scoring and the sections and the titles, all match the hard copy form they're an exact reflection of them. So as you'll see here, we have the first section, A, safety, and the first question is risk of femicide score. So we have the score laid out here for you in the 3 different descriptors, all side by side. We have the field for entering the score there. But now what you'll see is different is below here we have danger assessment type, DA, and total DA score 17. So that means for this woman, she had a DA completed and the total score was 17. So that information is automatically loaded from her file. So this will refer to the last DA completed on her file. As we move down here, we see the level of violence score. So information pertinent to this or that relates to this question from her intake is the type of abuse experienced. So this automatically loads for this woman and it lists the type of abuse experience that is documented on her intake form. Now here you'll see the number 3 is engaged in staying safe score. This is related to the DVSA, as you'll see in the descriptor here. So below here, the DVSA score will automatically load if she has a DVSA completed on her file. I'm just going to refer back quickly to my notes. Okay. So I'm just going to go through as we come down here to section B, poverty. Again, we pulled in any information from her intake form that related to the descriptors. So client self-reported financial situation intake. So that's the field on her intake, and that's how she answered it, somewhat of a concern. Her employment status and her employment status detail. Now, in the case that one of these questions was not completed on her intake, then it simply won't appear below. So it wouldn't say employment status and then blank. This whole, it just wouldn't appear at all. So the question and the answer only appears if there's something completed in that field on her most recent intake. Again, as I'm going along, please let us know if you have any questions through the question box. So we have our educational score there, which is related to the highest level of education completed. We tried to complete her intake completely, so this shows you all of the fields that we pulled into this tab. English and basic literacy scores. We have our translator questions pulled in, preferred languages and languages spoken, again from her intake, and it will load the information entered on her last completed intake. So the supports in place you'll see there. We don't have any questions on the intake that relate to or that inform this question. So as you'll see, there's nothing that loads below it. And for the professional support score. But exposure to marginalization or oppression, as you can see, we do have related questions from her intake and those automatically loaded there. I'm just gonna keep on scrolling down, so it's pretty self-explanatory. This is the same for D housing stability, the questions that have related information on her intake will automatically load. These are the 3 questions automatically load. And this is the same as well as we roll down for mental health and wellness. Now I'm going to keep on scrolling until children. So we see here in section G, children, that she has 0 children. So we've linked this to relationships and children's intakes. So this form automatically, it has queries hidden in the background, and it looks for if she has anyone related to her in the system and if they're a child, and then it would load the number of children here.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have a question, and also I wanted to make a point about the children. Yes. We have a question, is it using second stage intake or emergency shelter intake? This is what I was referring to earlier when I said if you try to use it for emergency, the form isn't going to work in the right way. Sorry, the query that pulls this information into this form is searching only for second stage admissions. So only information will show up if it is on a second stage intake, and won't show up if it's on an emergency shelter intake. And another thing about the children is that Irene had mentioned that you want to enter information for any children that the woman have, regardless of if they're admitted into shelter. This will only show you children information if they are entered into sheltered with the woman. So, for example, it says this woman has 0 children, but that's only because they don't have any children that are admitted with them. They might have children outside of that. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at this information.
Okay, thanks, Christoph. And that's a very good point. And this does say in our descriptor here, number of children admitted with women. But thank you as well. I didn't acknowledge that this can only pull information on the children admitted with her. That was a very good question, Leonie, about if this pulls from the emergency or second stage. And as Christoph says, this only pulls from the second stage intake. But something I want to point out too for documenting second stage information, that it's important to fill out these fields on or to complete information if you have it on the second stage intakes as well. Okay, I'll keep on moving on then. We're going to see I'm going to show you on our second person. Okay, so this is our single woman right here. So she has, as you can see, it tells you that she has 0 children admitted with her, and there's nothing loading for these children information score because she doesn't have any children. Now I'm going to flip over to our second test woman, and she has 2 children. So hers looks a bit different. So as you can see, or she has 2 children admitted with her, sorry. So it loads, it tells you that she has 2 admitted, and then their ages at intake. There's just a comma between the information. And then children's score, related information is pulled from the children's intake. So the question is, it says child to indicate for the users that this is information being pulled from the children's intake. And it says, does the client have any self-reported physical health concerns at the time of intake? No, yes, specify. So what that means there is it's showing you the answers for both the children. So that's what the comma in between is. And unfortunately, that's the only way we can present it is with that comma, because this is pulling from a query. And we can see for this question, does the client have any self-reported cognitive mental health concerns at the time of the intake? So that question was only answered for 1 child, and that answer was no. And if it's answered for more than 1 child, again, it'll appear like a comma and then a second answer beside it. So as we go down, we can see more information, again, that's being pulled from the children's intake. And it doesn't, you can't specifically see from here necessarily which child answered which question, but from our understanding and when we are completing this or creating this, you don't necessarily need to know which child these questions are being answered for. It asks for if essentially they have at least 1 child with this information or 2. So at least 1 child has exposed to frequent emotional, verbal, or psychological violence. And then again, the next score up is that she has at least 1 child. So the fact that you can't necessarily see which child these answers are for shouldn't take away from or shouldn't inhibit you from answering the questions. They should be able to support it. Okay, I'm going to flip back to our original test person number 1 because we have more information completed for them. We're almost here at the end. Again, system involvement. We have from her intake related immigration questions, legal score questions, and then overall system involvement score. So here there's no information, but I'm going to flip back to show you that overall system involvement, there are related questions for children that help inform that. So if the woman has children and these fields are completed, child welfare or custody arrangements, they will automatically load for overall system involvement. Okay, I'm just going to flip back now to our original person. So after you have entered the information, you may be simply doing data entry in that you already completed the Acuity Scale in hard copy form. So that's just fine. And the related information that automatically shows on here, you can use that to double check your answers or to bolster your answers, or you can simply just enter your information. But if you're not using a hard copy form and you're just using this digital form, then the information is meant to load to support you answering these questions. And so you don't have to flip back and forth to her intake tab or to her DVSA tab, DA tab, and PSI, and to her children's information, because it's a lot of different places. It's like half a dozen different places of information that you'd have to flip between to find this. So this was the general idea and what shelters requested, to have all this information in one place. So after you manually enter the numbers, none of the numbers load automatically. So even though we show the score for the DA or the DVSA or the PSI, and that determines what category or what score the woman gets, it doesn't automatically load into this field. This is all manual entry, the actual questions. However, when you get to the bottom of the form, the total score is automatically calculated. So we see right now that I have 0 because I entered no information. It says low acuity, no or few issues are present. So the woman has low acuity because it's a 0. But at the same time, as Irene mentioned, this scale is only valid if it is valid with 26 of the 28 questions answered. So essentially, if you have 3 or more blanks or 3 or more unanswered questions, then it's not considered a valid score. So this note right here about the total score will pop up if you have 3 or more empty fields to let you know that it's not considered a valid score. I'm just going to check back to my notes for a second. I am going to draw your attention here to a feedback box that we have at the bottom. Now, we put this in originally when we were piloting the scale, but we are still interested in shelter feedback and user feedback on this scale. So we've left this in here, and we will would love if you could provide your feedback through this box. Your feedback can be based on a specific person. So this is, if I had some sort of feedback or run into some issue with this woman called Acuity Test 1, you could enter your feedback into this text here and save it. But also you can use this feedback box to provide global feedback. So if you just have some global feedback or some thoughts on the scale or issues you're running into, whether it's having to do with practice and how you complete it, or how it's working your shelter, anything like that, you can also provide your global feedback through this box on any individual's Acuity tab. If you have a specific question or something you need a response from, then we need you to email OT support at acws.ca, and you'll receive an immediate response there. Okay, I think I'm going to hand it off to Christoph now. Christoph, you're going to go, I think you had a bit more about the calculations, and you're going to go into troubleshooting.
Sure, so I will let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so the calculations are pretty self-explanatory. You enter your score here, 0, 3, or 5. One thing I do want to mention is that at the bottom, we have this total score is not valid because there are 3 or more incomplete items. The incomplete does not refer to zeros. So if you don't have anything to put in a particular score, for instance, risk of femicide, rather than leaving it blank, you should put in 0. And then that won't count towards the 3 blank that you can't have in the, I'll increase my text there a little bit. That won't count against the 3 blank that you can't have in your shelter, or sorry, in your form. So, but other than that, the only things that you can put as a score for any one thing are 0, 3, and 5. If you try to put something else, you will get a warning, an error message here. It won't stop you from saving it, and it won't stop you from entering that in, but just so you know, if you should pay attention to these because the scores can only be 0, 3, or 5. Of course, if I enter a 0, it goes away. And if I put in, let's say 3, 5, 0, 3, 5, and then go down to the bottom, we see that it's calculating my score here, and it continues to calculate as I put things in. So yeah, it's pretty simple. The calculation happens automatically as you score items. One thing I want to discuss is when there's discrepancies between the form, the paper form, because I know that a lot of people are going to be filling out the paper form and then entering it into Outcome Tracker, and what happens sometimes is that there's a discrepancy between the two. What I would advise you to do when there is a discrepancy is to review it very, very closely, the paper form to what's in Outcome Tracker, because in my experience with troubleshooting these discrepancies, it's always the case that there was a mistake on the paper form, or the paper form was miscalculated, and that's why there's a difference between the difference between what's in Outcome Tracker and what's on the paper form. So I would just advise you to check it, and if you still see a discrepancy that you can't explain, then double check it. And then at that point, if you still see a discrepancy in total scores, then contact OT support at acws.ca, and then we can start looking at it together. But yeah, that's my advice. Another thing in doing the pilot that we've learned that people sometimes do is one is you can overwrite the total score. I would ask you not to do that. And another thing that people got confused about was overall system involvement score. This seems like a total score field, and so sometimes, especially if a woman didn't have children and so therefore didn't have any information to report in this section, people would put their total score in here. So let's say this person's total score is 32, they would put 32 in here, and then it would essentially almost double their score, and they wouldn't understand why But that's one of the issues that we had, is just make sure when you're entering information that you're not using this as if it were a total score field. This is another field that just 0, 3, or 5 is what you should enter. That mistake makes sense. Overall score, and it's at the bottom of the form. It makes sense that mistake could be made, but it isn't asking for the total score in this field. So that's just one thing that we learned. So I want to talk really quickly about reporting. So let me open up the report.
Christoph?
Yes.
Can you hear me, Christoph? I'm just going to
Yes.
interrupt because we have a question here from, I'm just keeping in mind that we're almost at 11:30. The recording keeps on going and we're fine. Keep on going past 11:30. Is that correct on GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar?
Yeah, it'll record until we stop the webinar.
Okay, perfect. So let's just, we'll just address, I just saw Charlie and Laura have a question in case they have to leave at 11:30. And they asked about the children that are not admitted. What about the children that are not admitted? We are counting all children that a woman has. And Charlie and Laura, that is correct. So in the section G, can you just scroll down to the section
Sure.
G there, Christoph? The only information that we're able to pull up is the number of children admitted with her, because we don't collect information on non-admitted children. But if you read the questions, so the information that pops up is meant to support you answering the questions, but it's not necessarily all the information you may need, because in the actual scoring of the children section, you can see in section G, number 21. So you have enter a score of 0 if the woman does not have any children, either residing with her or elsewhere. Enter a score of 3 if the woman has between 1 and 3 children under 18 years of age who are either residing with her or elsewhere. So you're correct in counting those children that are or using that information about children that are residing elsewhere in that scoring, Charlie and Laura. We just don't have information on non-admitted children in the system, so that's why no information pops up. And that's why we did specifically say number of children admitted with the woman, because that's all that we can speak to. So hopefully that answered that question. We are at 11:30, so we'll go through the reports quickly. Is it okay, Christoph? I can show the, or you're opening the reports? Sure. Okay. I'll talk and you can open up the report, Christoph?
Sure.
Perfect. Okay, so we currently have one report created right now. In order to find it, you go into the ACWS network report, and then your queries under reports by form or activity. And we have an acuity scale activity there, and then you'll see the acuity scale total report, which I already have open on my screen, Christoph, if you want me to switch to mine.
Maybe I'll make you the presenter.
Okay, perfect. Just let me know when you can. Okay, perfect. Okay, so here is what it looks like right now. So we have a report start date and end date. So this will pull in all of your clients that have an acuity scale completed within a date range, and it will file them into low, moderate, high, or very high acuity according to their score. And it'll tell the number of clients here, and then also what percentage of that it makes up for all your clients at that time. Now, as always with our reports, they are linked. So you'll be able to click on that number and see and be taken to the actual query to see the women's information. Now, we currently only have this report created to support the acuity activity right now in OT, but we will also be adding a query, a very simple query that just lists for a date range all of the clients and their acuity scores. We're also going to add, when we add the provider field or the assessor's name to the acuity scale, we can add in a filter to that query so you can just pull women for which a certain staff member completed their Acuity or completed that form for them, assuming they're the service provider. But what we are looking for is we'll be creating more reports in the future for this activity, but we're looking for a bit of user feedback. So once the shelters actually start using this report, we're looking for shelter feedback to let us know what sort of reports you would find useful in the shelter, whether it's reports to support shelter operations, in terms of if you use the Acuity to determine staff workload, to distribute higher, more acute women more evenly over the staff, or whether you're using the report, if you want to report like for funders, to show the number or the level of acuity of your population in shelter, something like that. So over the next couple of months, we'll be soliciting any feedback you have on reports you'd like created. As always, we can create reports specific to just your shelter, but we will also create more global reports that all shelters can use.
So we have a couple questions. Is this
Okay.
report only clients who've completed Acuity Scale this month, or for clients being currently served? So this report right now is for anybody who's completed an Acuity Scale for this month, which of course you can change the dates if you want it to be for 6 months or a year or what have you, but this report will only pull people who have completed an Acuity Scale within this time period rather than clients being served. But that is a report that we can make if there's interest in it. And then we have another question. Should we be putting in previously done Acuity scores into Outcome Tracker?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question. And yes, I believe, I might let Irene chime in, but I believe we would want that information. We asked the 2 pilot shelters to do the same thing when they started, to back enter Acuity forms. Irene, are you there?
Yeah, no, yes is the more we can get in there, the better. It just how far back you go is entirely up to you, because I know that there have been some people who have been doing Acuity Scale for a few years now, so it might be just too much to go back and do this, so you might not have the resources to do it. So you can make a decision, that we'll enter all the Acuity Scales back for 2019. That might be, and then that would end up, it might range depending on how many people you admit in any particular year, but it could range from 2 to 25, I guess. So it really does depend on the individual shelter and what you decide to do. So if it really does depend on your resources, but the further back you can go, the better, because then we can start speaking about Acuity Scale in a more informed way for the collective.
Okay, great. Thank you, Irene. Okay, Christoph, do we have any more questions?
Nope.
Okay. Oh, I see Elia wrote a question. I probably liked one where I can see scales on served clients during a time range. Okay, yeah. Oh, and you already spoke about that, Christoph, eh?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I think that's all the information for the reports. As I said, it's a work in progress. And another thing to add that we're looking at in terms of using the Acuity information, we're looking at adding it to shelters' quarterly dashboards. That's information that executive directors get on a quarterly basis. And we're looking at adding the Acuity Scale, and if there's related goals data, that's something else we're considering adding to the quarterly dashboards in order to better support the summarization of information for shelters. Okay, I'm just going to look at my notes. I think that's pretty pretty much it. So we will just wait a couple moments to see if anyone else has any more questions. That's the end of our technical section. So if you have any questions, you can ask questions both about Irene's section or ours, then I'll open the floor.
While we're waiting for questions, I can explain that this webinar has been recorded, and so in a few days, we will probably be, well, not probably, we will be putting this up on our YouTube account, our YouTube channel, so you can access this webinar at your leisure anytime that you need to refresh your memory, or if you have people, staff in your shelter who weren't able to attend, but they still need to know information about the Acuity Scale, they can watch it on the YouTube channel.
Perfect, that's a good point.
But we're not getting any more questions.
No questions. Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. So I think on that note, if there's not any more questions right now, then we will wrap up the webinar. You are welcome to ask us questions at any time. You can email otsupport@acws.ca. And that's the same email address you use for any outcome tracker questions. And again, as Irene said earlier, if they are content questions, then we're going to be forwarding those to Irene, and she will be able to provide information as a content expert, and any technical questions Christoph will be able to answer. Okay, Irene and Christoph, do you have anything else to add before we sign off?
No, I think that's good.
Yeah, nothing for me either. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you to all the attendees for coming today. We really appreciate it. It was a great showing, and we will be sending out to everyone that attended, all the shelters actually, all the second stage shelters will be sending out the link to the YouTube page for this webinar. And again, just email us at otsupport@acws if you have any questions. Okay, and have a great day. Thank you.